in the current generation we live in these next 20, 40, 60 years, I imagine a number of African countries will go through the exact process that East Asian countries and some of these small city-states went through in the end of the 20th century. And that's where actually most of the global wealth was created in the 20th century. And so I believe the biggest amount of wealth generation, the biggest transformation, the biggest industrial changes we will see, that we will talk about, and our children and grandchildren and future generations will talk about, is what happens in African markets in these years.
My next guest started his career at the first private equity firm to ever exist in the former Soviet Union. That tells you something important about him. He has always been drawn to the frontier, to the places that others overlook, to the markets that are early, complicated, and full of opportunities that most people are not yet sophisticated enough to see. Mark Kleyner is widely regarded as one of Africa's most sought-out voices on the venture and investment ecosystem. He has worked at 8 venture capital firms across 4 continents, helped launch multiple technology investment funds of 10 million or more, and trained over 800 founders and investors worldwide. He is the co-founder and co-CEO of Dream VC, a leading venture capital institute focused on emerging markets that has trained more than 400 investors from 50 countries whose funds collectively manage over 10 billion in asset under management. Through Dream VC, he has built something remarkable, a pipeline that takes professionals who have no VC connections, no family office backing, no insider access, and turn them into credible, active investors in African markets. He is also co-lead Edge by Dream VC, the firm's corporate venture enablement arm, supporting corporations in designing and executing venture capital funds across sectors including fintech, energy, logistics, and advanced manufacturing. He's a frequent speaker at major global conferences, including Super Return, AIM, Afrique Arena, and the Deep Tech Summit, sharing stages with some of the most powerful investors in the world. He's also an angel investor in over 20 countries and sits on boards of startups, including Deliman in Nigeria. In his own personal time, by his own admission, he's an enthusiastic fan of hippos. Please welcome Mark Kleyner to Africa Capital Connect. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Kwame. A great summary. Let's get into it.
Absolutely, Mark. Before we start, Mark, I love to get into, I guess, their journey, where they were born, where they were from.
Yeah, sure. Well, firstly, I guess personally, a good thing to know is that I'm originally of Eastern European descent. I'm Ukrainian by my mother and Russian through my father. I grew up actually in Moscow before moving over to London to finish my studies, and this is really a big part of what shaped my character. I think often individuals see where I work and they see me in India or in Africa or in the Middle East, and they say, well, that seems like a pretty big jump from, upbringing in the UK. And I would say that is, but once you combine that with, an immigrant household and also feed in the fact that background comes from Eastern Europe, and that has many more parallels perhaps to the markets that I tend to find myself in. So there is that, I think, as chapter 1. I think after that, it's studies up in the UK, where I actually studied up in Edinburgh in Scotland. And that was really what exposed me a little bit more to that open-minded thinking on just how big the world really is and how connected it is. Scotland itself has a pretty interesting history, sitting on the doorstep of the UK, but sometimes having ties back to Hong Kong, to India, to African markets as well during Britain's imperial heyday. And in that sense, studying in an institution that has a 500-year-old history, that also opened up my eyes to just how close you can actually be, even sitting in the UK, to what's going on all over the world. That then leads into consulting. So I started my career in the consulting space in strategy consulting and digital consultancy, and was quite fortunate to have my first experience supported by experience with startups and SMEs. I guess a little bit unusually got exposed to the tech sector quite early, and something that for sure certainly played a role with my father's technical background, which kind of gave me that initial idea of, okay, technology is a force for good. And that ultimately led me to then working internationally. So having some experience working US side and working in Singapore in last mile logistics and food and consumer tech businesses, which then finally brought me to West Africa and Nigeria, working in the growth stage startups and early stage startup support space, which then paved the way for my career into the venture space. Now, throughout that, had a chance to work part-time and eventually full-time with several VC firms. Was fortunate to both see how VC looks like on the US side of things. Even got to work in a fund out of Sand Hill Road itself, but also with some funds out of Eastern Europe, as I think you mentioned in the introduction, and a fund or two out of the UK as well, before now making my career very much Africa focused. And today I run Dream VC, a holding company which we set up initially to try and create and foster a generation of new African focused investors, which has grown into a bigger ecosystem, investment ecosystem of sorts, where we both now create investors. We also actively invest ourselves into startups and SMEs, not just in African markets, but across several emerging market regions. And we've even moved into now this corporate venture building and corporate venture capital space, where we help corporations try and stay on top of what's going on with the world and invest themselves into startups. So quite a lot going on and a lot of jumps across their career, but suddenly ones that have left me better off, I would say, even if with a bit of a receding hairline.
Was that what you studied for in school, like trying to become a venture capitalist? How did you end up landing into that direction?
No, it's a good question. To be honest, going into university, I've never heard of the word venture capitalist. And I think I wouldn't blame quite a few of our listeners if they haven't either. It's a pretty specific niche. In fact, venture capital firms globally number under 20,000. So you'll probably find more banks in Canada or in California or in New York than you would find venture capitals all across the entire world. It's a very, very specific small part of the financial sector. I think me coming across the sector to some extent, I mean, I don't know to what extent we can call it, fate or not fate, but I think it was statistically quite likely. I've always had a fascination with financial markets. My first career was in financial markets. My first ever job was with a private equity firm. So I wasn't that distant from the venture space. But I think what actually led me to venture was my interest and passion for technology. So I actually first went to university to study computer science. I ended up graduating with a completely different major. So I ended up majoring in economics and in geography. Economics perhaps a little bit helpful on the financing side, and geography with that open-minded approach to just seeing that great things can happen all over the world. But I think it really was the computer science part that led me closer to the idea that, okay, some of the best things happening around the world come from the technology sector, and somebody needs to fund that technology. So actually, my first ever time hearing about VC was working in a startup where the startup got funded by several venture capitalists. And I was thinking, okay, so who are these guys? Why are they funding this startup? How does it work? Why do they exist? And that curiosity is what eventually led me to moving into the venture space.
What is a venture capitalist?
All right. Well, I'll start by explaining what a venture capitalist is not, and then I'll explain what they are. So, what they are not is what is presented sometimes if we like to watch kind of Hollywood around capital markets. And there you see somebody walking around, usually nice, clean shaven guy, walks into a conversation with some hippie looking founder. The VC is always dressed in a nice suit, very serious, and carries a briefcase full of cash. And they say, look, I'm going to invest in your company. Here's the cash. You give me the percentage in the company, and now we have a relationship. That's what most people think a venture capitalist is. And to some extent, it's not fully false, because that image does capture a little bit of the VC space. But if we had to take a step back to what VCs really are, venture capitalists are essentially a specific type financier. So they are finance professionals who sit at the earliest stage of the financial world. So if we think that everything in the world in some ways is powered by, revolves by, or involves money in one way, shape, or form, there are banking institutions that lend money, extend credit, extend debt. There are bigger financial institutions that pump money into the economy or take money out of the economy, and most purchases of goods and services rely on an exchange of money as a unit of currency, right? But what happens at the very, very, very early stage, before banks can get involved, before the traditional markets can get involved, before retail investors or you and I can invest in a company? Somebody is creating a new idea, and that idea requires funding, but the funding is not easily available. So venture capitalists are a specific type of investor who invests in businesses that cannot access bank loans, that cannot access traditional instruments, traditional infrastructure that's built to support companies, because they are super early stage, which means that they're potentially just at idea level or they haven't yet reached maturity. Often they are not making profit, which means they're loss-making businesses. So many traditional investors do not want to back them. And often these businesses have a wacky plan of how they will take over the world. either because they have a business innovation, they want to change the way we pay for something, change the way we consume a product, change the way that we actually engage in financing some good or service, or they have a technological innovation. So they want to change the actual utility, moving us from a horse and carriage to a car, moving us from a car to a plane, moving us from a plane to, well, God knows what's coming next, hovercraft, teleportation, or whatever else. Believe your sci-fi fantasy at will. So that's the technical definition. Early stage financier, financing risky businesses that nobody else wants to look at. But the way I see it, it's almost like an overlapping Venn diagram between the sci-fi enthusiasts who always want to see and live in a future technologically enabled world, the financiers who want to go a bit earlier and want to have more impact and potentially not just think about the funding side, but also the sentimental or emotional connection you have with someone during a transaction, and somebody who is a little bit of an entrepreneur who wants to come up with an idea of their own, but maybe doesn't have a perfect idea just yet. So wants to help someone else build that. Combine that sci-fi enthusiast, the financier, and that entrepreneurial thinking, and you end up with a venture capitalist. And that's really what a VC is all about.
Interesting. So does the VC always take interest in the entrepreneurship journey or the idea, or are they just giving the funds and collecting the interest on that?
So actually, VCs, most of the time, we don't even charge interest. So the way that VCs work is most of the time they invest to get ownership in a business rather than extending a loan. The majority, more than 90% of VC transactions come in the form of equity financing, which means they are buying equity or ownership in a company or in an enterprise rather than debt financing, which is where you extend money to someone and you expect that money back, often with something on top. That's the interest conversation. Because VCs typically invest in companies that aren't yet profitable, there's no dividends either. So it's not like we're sharing profits with the companies we invest in. In fact, the ways that VCs make money is a bit similar to how you'd make money investing in real estate or in construction. You invest in a business just as you might invest in a house. That house might not be ready, just like the business might not yet be profitable. You support that business to scale and to improve its operations and to look better and improve their marketing and sales, a little bit like renovating the house you've invested in. And then you sell the business and you sell your ownership, that portion you own in the business, to someone else. That would be the same as just renovating the house, flipping it, and selling it to someone else. Just as with the house, in general, the biggest transaction comes from you spending money to buy it and you earning money to sell it, not necessarily in what happens in between. In VC, it's very similar. Some VCs that invest in much later stage businesses will see some profit sharing and will see some money back. So sometimes they even might use a little bit of debt. But the reason why VCs don't do this that often is that because they're investing so early, investments come with a lot of risk. And because there's so much risk, VCs expect a really disproportionate return. Now, the only way you can get that disproportionate return is just through capital appreciation, through the value of the asset itself getting much more expensive. So, in the analogy to a house, if you have to rent out a house for maybe 200 years, or you can just buy a house, get lucky, there's a development nearby, the house price goes 10 times higher, and you sell the house. So, this is what VCs are doing, except we hope we're not getting lucky. We're trying to actually systematically engineer the outcomes where our proverbial house investments, the startups we invest in, actually go scale and become these big corporates by the time we sell.
What are some of the common expectations a VC will require from a company to invest in that company? And when you say disproportional return, are we talking like they're taking 60%, giving you 40%? Like, what are the numbers on that?
So, firstly, there's infinite criteria that you can look at for what a successful business might look like, right? But generally speaking, there's some things that are universal. Universally, most early stage investing, and early stage usually means the companies are not yet profitable, they're scaling, they're growing quite quickly. It involves investing in companies that typically are growing faster than 100% year on year, which already eliminates, let's say, 99% of businesses out there in the real world that usually aren't growing as quickly. It involves investing in businesses that are tech enabled. Why? Because technology tends to scale faster than people. If you have a database or you have a drone or you have a manufacturing plant that is using some kind of digital element to its construction, for you to increase production or to sell 100 times more or to sell 100 times more data is just a matter of your infrastructure spend. It's a bit different to, for example, the agricultural space or land, which doesn't scale. Land is land. Land can go and get submerged in water, and then you don't have land anymore. but land doesn't generate more land in the same way as a house doesn't grow into multiple houses. Meanwhile, a company can very well grow into multiple companies, can grow into a conglomerate, can even become, in some cases, as we see with companies like Alphabet, and Apple, and Uber, tens of billions or hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars worth, which exceeds the total valuation of some countries as a whole. Now, what does that make it? Kind of back to the point, what makes a good company? Well, a very strong team, a team with both the founder or entrepreneurial gusto to come up with a good idea, but also the management expertise and the operational background to scale whatever product or service they're delivering. A very good product or service, something that is disproportionately better than what exists in the market. In the same way as Uber was disproportionately better than ordering a taxi before technology, in the same way now we expect any new technology, whether it's in healthcare, in the defense sector, in the insurance sector, should be at least 5, 10 times better than whatever exists today. A good market, i.e., an environment in which people want to pay for the solution, something that ideally solves a problem that is needed, that is urgent, that is demanded, and that people are willing to pay someone else to solve, but also a good combination of other factors. One of the ones that most VCs in particular value more than even private equity, more than any other investor, is what we call the unique differentiator. So, what separates a restaurant from a restaurant that will become the next McDonald's? What separates a random entertainment company from the company that will become the next Disney or the next Netflix? Often it's some kind of spark of greatness, and that part is usually harder to quantify. And this is one of the reasons why VCs believe they won't get replaced by artificial intelligence. Sometimes it's just the weirdest or craziest of things that give someone that unique advantage. And VCs make it their life job to try and find the patterns, find the types of signals that suggest, you know what, maybe Kwame has it in him to build $1 billion company. And so we'll go and invest in him.
So, Mark, why Africa? I mean, I think you could have invested in Silicon Valley, London, Ukraine, Russia. Why did you choose Africa?
Well, I think there's several stories here that kind of overlap, and I will caveat that I have invested before in the US and in Silicon Valley and in Eastern Europe and many other markets before. So it's not that I completely ignored the potential of these markets either. It's more so that I made it my primary focus, I would say, really for now and hopefully for the foreseeable future to invest in African markets in particular and other developing regions as a secondary focus to that. And I think this comes to a combination of anecdotal experiences and just statistics that I think won't go away. The anecdote comes from working in West Africa myself and just recognizing the enormous opportunity that existed for both economic, social, and technological change that could be done through technology companies and through the technology sector. I think when we look at Silicon Valley or we look at Tokyo or we look at, for example, Toronto or any other well capitalized, well developed ecosystem in a country and environment which has been enabling for business for a while, you can't really imagine suddenly this city being completely different except by going to that purely sci-fi sense of yourself. And what do most sci-fi movies tell us about future Tokyo? Current Tokyo, but with higher skyscrapers. What does it tell us about San Francisco? Current San Francisco, but with people flying around in cars. That's not actually that big of a change from what we already have. But then combine that with an assessment of the future of Lagos in Nigeria, or the future of Accra in Ghana, or the future of Kigali in Rwanda. And you can very much imagine an enormous shift in the before and after, because that shift is something that's actually already happened. So I had a chance to work in Singapore early in my career, and just seeing what Singapore went through in essentially one generation is astounding. I think it's something that I'd recommend really to anyone who travels around the world at some point to see. What Singapore did, what South Korea did, what Hong Kong did, what a number of the cities on the Chinese mainland did, absolutely astounding. How you go from a fishing village with really 1 story, 2 story, three-level buildings to having a city full of skyscrapers with universal healthcare, fantastic tax systems, great penetration of urban transport, public transport, massive efforts to promote safety all around. It's almost hard to imagine. So for me, growing up in a huge metropolis in Moscow and then in London, I imagined I was in some ways in parts of the center of the world. And then you go to Asia and you're like, oh, so especially in parts of East Asia, this is just absolutely insane. Now apply that to the African context. Most African countries in the last 20 years have gone from having limited to no internet access to having near full internet penetration. Most have gone from having a majority of the population being unbanked or without access to traditional financial services to now having more than 50% of the population being banked or having direct to indirect access to financial services. Telecom penetration went from less than 25% to now more than 50%, even in most rural areas we see across Africa. We see mobile money payments, so payments made through satellite link, actually operating faster and more efficiently than even digital payments, card payments, and the stuff we're used to seeing in Europe or the States. All of these things I'm describing, it represents a bit of a paradigm shift that in the current generation we live in these next 20, 40, 60 years, I imagine a number of African countries will go through the exact process that East Asian countries and some of these small city states went through in the end of the 20th century. And that's where actually most of the global wealth was created in the 20th century. And so I believe the biggest amount of wealth generation, the biggest transformation, the biggest industrial changes we will see that we will talk about and our children and grandchildren and future generations will talk about is what happens in African markets in these years. So I think that's the biggest, let's say, macro point. On a micro level, I've also seen something that's very unique. And Kwame, we had a chat about this in particular around something that's unique to African diaspora groups, which I think is particularly strong and which in my mind only emulates perhaps Indian diaspora, but is much stronger than in any other diaspora group. And that is that when you look at Nigerian diaspora, you look at Ghanaian diaspora, you look at Tunisians abroad, Egyptians abroad, Moroccans abroad, what are they doing? Well, they're staying incredibly connected with their home market. Not only are they sending money back home, they're regularly traveling back home, they're supporting the education, the business building, the real estate building of their families and their relatives back home, but they're also bringing that international expertise that they capture and that they get abroad and bringing it back to Africa. So I sometimes say that this is almost like the reverse of the unfortunate effects we saw of colonialism. You see the African diaspora going abroad, capturing, harnessing, learning, gathering the intelligence and the innovations that they can in the States and Europe, and then bringing that back and applying it with both better cultural understanding of the markets they operate in, but now also access to Western resources in an African context. And that part, that transition of the diaspora returning or making that shift, going abroad and coming back, going abroad and coming back, is something that I've seen in particular in the last decade. And that's actually an amazing factor that makes African markets that much more investable. Even if someone doesn't believe that there are a lot of entrepreneurs in Ethiopia, you can't say that there aren't a lot of entrepreneurs among Ethiopian diaspora in the DMV region in the East Coast. Even if someone says there aren't that many entrepreneurs that are building maybe deep tech or advanced manufacturing in Nigeria locally, well, I would bet that at least 1 in 100 of those who go to the UK or the US and get exposed to those hot sectors are going to likely come back and build the same in the Nigerian context. And that is very unique, actually, because you don't see that happening with British diaspora, with American diaspora, with any European country. If you're British and you go to another country, that's it. You don't look back necessarily. You don't send money back home. You don't invest back home. You don't necessarily do anything. The tie is kind of closed. And as someone from Eastern Europe, that's actually something I've come to see. A lot of Eastern European communities, they almost reinvent themselves. They move over to Germany or Israel or the States or Canada or the UK, and they become German or Israeli or Canadian or British. But they don't necessarily think about, okay, how do I eventually make my way back? And yet I speak to so many individuals of African descent who actually say, sure, I have my life here, but that doesn't mean that I'm ignoring my potential life back there. If anything, I actually have a unique advantage to have one foot in this world, one foot in another. And I've actually backed a number of businesses who've been built by a combination of diaspora-led founding teams and local-based founding teams, and they've done tremendously well. So yeah, I think that's something that is a big part of my investment thesis and something that I don't think will change anytime soon, which is why I think on that macro level and on the social level, African markets are super investable and will only continue to be investable as economies improve and the socioeconomic background improves as well.
I feel, and this probably might be my personal take on this, but I feel like a lot of the diaspora do find that Africa is risky. We don't invest back. We do send money back home. We do build our own personal home that we want to move back to eventually. But as far as investing in businesses and starting different entrepreneurship journey out there, I feel like we're not doing more on that front. Is there a misconception that Africa is corrupt and you'll lose your money while the Europeans or the Westerners or certain, Asian markets are going back to Africa and are building stuff in Africa and are creating, legacies and building different bridges and different stuff that, we're not doing. So is there a false perception of Africa and how we think Africa is corrupt that is misleading a little bit for the diaspora?
Well, I think it's not so much misconceptions as much as anecdotally led trust building, right? I think most of us, just any person anywhere around the world, most of the time we fall into a fallacy. It's a good thing and a bad thing that being human, we all make decisions based on what we find comfortable and what we've experienced. In many ways, this is why AI is so big now. It's because just like the human mind relies on pattern matching, we see something, we build on that pattern, we reinforce that pattern, and we get better and better and better at pattern matching over time. Tech works in a similar way. So I think for many folks in the diaspora, when they think about, okay, let's say I'm Nigerian, I moved to the UK, I Chapat, or I'm Ghanaian, I moved to the States, or anything else, they think about the ecosystem as they remember it. So the ecosystem as they remember it might have unfriendly regulations, might have unfriendly tax systems. There's currency risk, there's governance concerns, there might be difficulties in finding trustworthy partners, perhaps especially if you're used to engaging with people that you can interact with in person all the time. And it's not that easy to just, jump on a plane and hop over from DC to Accra or from London to Lagos. Even if there's a direct flight, sometimes it could be $2,000 out of pocket just for one way. So I think to some extent, most folks I interact with in the diaspora, they are not necessarily uniquely misinformed or misguided in any way on African markets. It's just that their knowledge and their experience is often one, out of date, and two, not specialized to this industry of startup financing, SME financing. So if you look at the broader picture, is there going to be corruption in most markets? Yes. I mean, in the same way as there's corruption everywhere, there will be corruption in many markets. And realistically, a lot of African countries are still much lower down on the ease of doing business lists than, for example, the UK or the US. Does that mean you cannot do business in those countries? No, absolutely not. Maybe it would be more difficult for you to get into government procurement, to get into military services, to get into selling a rocket, for example. But if you're selling startup solutions or SMEs, you're targeting individuals or businesses, often the environment is not that unfriendly as people think. And I think it's that maybe disconnect. So, one, the anecdote of the Africa that many diaspora remember from when they might have left, especially if they left more than one generation ago, and also the reality on ground that creates a little bit of that dissonance. Now, you asked, do we think that Europeans or Asian investors or American investors who aren't African are maybe coming in with an advantage? I wouldn't say so. I mean, if you look broadly speaking, still there is a higher rate of folks among the diaspora who will likely invest than among just any general American or any general British person or any general Chinese person. But there's certainly parallels and experience that international investors might have had and a greater degree of risk seeking that they might have had, which does manifest in them sometimes moving faster. So something that we saw that was consistent all the way up until last year is that between the 2010s and through to 2025, at the very early levels of financing, the very first or second round when a company raises funding, often it was an international investor who invested first before local African based investment firms and before diaspora business angels invested in any company. And maybe that's just because some of these international investors have already had time to build that risk tolerance by investing in other markets that had their own challenges in the day. Central America, Latin America, Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia. In some ways, that's why people say African markets are the last frontier for these international investors. But I think it's still very much, open world in that sense. There is not really any market in Africa which I would say is saturated. So there's a very, very big opportunity. And if anyone who is among the diaspora wants to get involved, it's much faster for them to do so than for someone purely internationally based who doesn't have that cultural connection, doesn't have that social understanding, and often doesn't have the running head start that someone might if they have a physical contact back home.
That's very interesting you said that, Mark, because I think a lot of us, who are African descent, we tend to feel like we don't have the advantage, even though we're originally from Ghana, from Nigeria. And I feel like somebody like yourself, as a Caucasian man, will go into Africa and more doors will open for you. But then I get the other side of it where people tell me that, no, actually, you being from Africa, you speak the language, you have a better relationship, you might be able to do more in Africa. Is there a misconception about that as far as advantages and disadvantages of being in Africa, going to do business in Africa versus somebody who's Asian or Caucasian, where I feel like the respect level sometimes is a little bit more higher and they think you're you're more financially stable, so you get more doors open for you. Is that a misconception?
It's not a misconception, but I would say it applies to particular contexts, right? So I'm going to separate the socioeconomic and the practical context. What I mean by socioeconomic and practical. So the socioeconomic context is that if you are comparing, let's say, a African-built startup that is led by a Kenyan or a Nigerian to one built by maybe a Chinese professional or an American in Kenya, you might look at the two and you might say, well, surely the African built business will do better because they understand the market better. They have the cultural connection to the market. They know how the market works than, say, the American or the Chinese built one. And in some things, you would probably be right. For example, in the customer interactions, in their proximity to the end beneficiary, in their avoidance of realistic problems that they might face with government, with local councils and others. Someone who's experienced that, maybe a Nigerian or Kenyan who's grown up with that and always had that in the back of their mind, they will avoid certain conversations, which maybe a Chinese founder or an American founder won't. But there's a reverse to that as well, because the Chinese founder or the American founder might not know that social context, and because people will know that they are foreign, it's not something you can really hide, often they will operate with a bit more gusto or a bit more indifference to local cultural barriers. So, for example, something that is quite common in many countries, it's the same in China for Chinese people, it's the same in Russia for Russian people, etc., is that there are social hierarchies in place. And social hierarchies often imply that, for example, if you're the youngest person in the room, maybe you shouldn't be the first one sitting. You shouldn't sit at the head of the table. You shouldn't do A, B, C, D. But in the same way as how we might excuse a foreigner who doesn't understand this if you are in Russia or in China or in Europe or in the US, because they're not part of our conventional, let's say, social hierarchy tree, the same thing applies in the African context. When an American investor does something that is considered a social faux pas, it usually would be rude to correct them. So you might not, which means that because you're not correcting them, you're actually giving them more leeway to operate without the constraints of these socioeconomic barriers. So you might see an American investor decide that rather than waiting for three levels of intermediaries to schedule a meeting with the president's office, they're going to speak to some other guy they've met randomly in the bar and say, hey, I want to make this happen. And I'm going to keep bothering them until they find me a connection who actually sets the meeting up. And then suddenly people then are up in arms and saying, oh, how dare you? How could you go ahead and try and skip the conventional process? But in their mind, because they don't know better, they've actually managed to cut down on the intermediaries and get something done faster. So I think that socioeconomic piece is something that I see a lot. The second piece that I would say that unfortunately does play in a foreigner's favor, but this is one that comes with a twist, is just what experience or resources you bring to the table. So something you mentioned, Kwame, is you said that a foreign founder or foreign investor, for example, might come in and they might assume that they're wealthier, right? That assumption, both for you, for me, for anyone, is based on the context of, okay, where are you coming from? What's your background? For example, if you are coming from working in McKinsey or Goldman in London, okay, you probably have a six-figure salary. Same in New York, same in San Francisco. Now, does that matter if you are a Caucasian professional who came from that background, or a African American professional, or Black professional, Asian professional? No, you would still have that salary. Now, that's where I'm coming with the point of the socioeconomic advantage. The type of people that you find who move from Europe or who move from the Middle East or who move from Asia or from the US to African markets are not a random spread of society. It's very select individuals, usually who are already upper middle class or the lower part of the upper class bracket of wealth and income, who have the resources to move despite the fact that there are many barriers to doing business. So somebody who can fund their own trip, who can fund their movement from the US to Kenya, who can fund moving their entire business over, moving their entire family over without a job necessarily, who comes in with the background and with the savings to keep themselves going for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2, 3 years before they start taking a paycheck. That's not your average American. Your average American can't afford a $500 emergency medical bill. That is someone who already is coming in with, that top echelon of society. Now, consider that and look at how that compares against the average individual building a startup in Kenya or in Nigeria. It's not just something that's reserved for someone in the upper middle class bracket. You might have someone building a startup straight out of school, straight out of uni. So the average, let's say, financial background, the average academic background, the average working age of somebody who's moving from abroad to rebuild their life in African markets is actually on average higher than the average age, the average wealth, the average background you'll see among local based founders. And that has had a very market effect on how investors back those companies. So if an investor is just looking at who has the biggest financial cushion to keep themselves running for a while, who has the most experience in international firms, who has that war chest to keep themselves going, often it will be that wealthier founder. And that's something where there is definitely an advantage of foreign to local, but that is an advantage that the diaspora have exact equal access to. So if there were more diaspora professionals joining that, then we wouldn't really be talking about whether it's a Caucasian founder or a Kenyan founder. We'd be talking about whether it's a Kenyan diaspora founder or a Kenyan founder succeeding in that environment. Because one to one, the diaspora would have an advantage to any international coming in without the diaspora connections, but with the same socioeconomic resources.
Mark, can you tell me a little bit more about Dream VC? I think I want to get into what Dream VC is, what you guys do, and what you guys are doing on the continent. And then I eventually want to move into some of the challenges you're facing on the African market.
So Dream VC is a venture capital institute and corporate venture advisory. What does that mean? We essentially are a firm that engages in trying to professionalize the early stage startup investment scene by training individuals to become better business angel investors, by training firms to become better venture capitalists, and by supporting individuals who are not currently angel investors and not currently venture capitalists to get into the world of startup investing. We do so through remote and in-person programs that we run for individuals and firms all over the world, usually with an African focus or a focus on the Middle East, on South or Southeast Asia, where we teach individuals through a trade school approach. Essentially, you're being taught by active professionals. So individuals like myself and others who are actively investing are teaching others who are looking to invest more actively or looking to learn from best practice. We combine that with a very tech-centric approach because all of our team are former entrepreneurs, former venture capitalists ourselves. We have a very healthy appreciation of how technology can get things moving faster. And our goal on that side is really to, as I said, create a new generation of investors who have more skin in the game and who are really, really committed to the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of the African investment ecosystem. And that's something that's worked quite well. Today, we have more than 450 alumni who've gone through our programs. They sit across more than 100 different investment funds that they've created or joined or supported or scaled into Africa. And these funds manage more than $10 billion a year in allocations looking at Africa. So the network of Dream VC extends far, far, far beyond our own investment activities. So that's the core side. That's what most people know us for, that venture capital institute. And for that, I mean, if anyone was listening and they thought, look, I want to get more into the investment space, I wanted to learn how to be an investor, I want to potentially start my journey as a business angel, sitting outside the continent or inside the continent or joining the VC world, it's very easy. That's what the institute is really for. We created it with that idea of both for international participants, let's say in Africa's innovation future, and for local or diaspora participants, there should be an easy route, something like a Harvard, like a Stanford, like a London Business School or an INSEAD, to professionally move into the space, and that's what the institute is. Now, the flip side of that is because we now have the institute and that's been running quite well now for half a decade in enabling the ecosystem, making the ecosystem much larger and opening up doors and making investing in African markets that much more professionalized. We've now also have this arm of the advisory side and the corporate venture capital side, where we've been actually building funds for others and then sometimes taking on the management and operations of those funds. That's done underneath our subsidiary Edge, which really stands for the efforts we have in empowering disruptive growth and entrepreneurship in traditional business, which means working with a telco to suddenly transform that into a digitally enabled business, working with a business like a traditional retailer to turn it into a digital enabled, digital first online platform, working with an oil and gas company to get them to decarbonize, or at least to become much more digitally enabled, much more technologically advanced in how they actually do their day-to-day business. And all of this happening through the process of corporate venturing, which is essentially when a corporation or a big business or family holding or medium-sized business goes and applies the mindset of thinking a little bit like an entrepreneur and a little bit like a venture capitalist and either building startups themselves or investing in startups. So really, that's what Dream VC is all about. And yeah, so far so good. So been 5 years, and we already have a presence in most African markets. We already have a reach of our partners and the funds that we manage in West, Eastern Africa, Middle East, and parts of the South and Southeast Asian regions. And we think it's only up from here because as more people get into the space, there's going to be a lot more people who can actually work in funds. And when there are more people who can work in funds, there'll be more people who are fund managers. More fund managers means more investment. And the more investment there is, the more people there are asking, how can I get involved? Which is where the Institute really does play that knowledge infrastructure layer.
Are there any challenges that Dream VC is facing being on the continent? I know with a lot of us, we think about the political issues with Africa, doing business in Africa. You know, you always have to reach out to someone within government, or in your situation, it's not like you're actually building a specific product in Africa. So is there issues you face in the African market?
Absolutely. I mean, I had to take a bit of a double take when you said African market because, it's like 54, 55, let's say, legal markets, and in practice, more like 555 practical markets. If you think about operating in different parts of the continent, I mean, I don't know how much, Kwame, you've had as a chance to travel around, if you have, but for example, even just between Accra and let's say Kumasi, you'll have a little bit of a different ecosystem that you're operating in the Ghanaian context. Go to Nigeria and it's like five different countries, all of which don't necessarily get along with each other. The North, the South, the Southeast, the Southwest, the Federal Capital Territory, they're all kind of different clusters of their own. So in every case, I think whenever we talk to international corporates or international investors or even to diaspora professionals and they say, hey, I want to invest in Africa, I mean, if someone told you I want to invest in Asia, you'd say that's stupid because Asia is an enormous continent. Why is it then we say that I want to invest in Africa is fine when it's also an enormous continent, which is almost comparable in size to Asia and probably at some point population wise will be bigger than Asia? There's just so many linguistic differences, ethnic differences, cultural differences, which affect the ease of doing business. So certainly that affects us. I mean, I think there isn't a single market in Africa where it's been easy for us to do business in terms of the training, the venture capital creation, the ecosystem building, or where it's been easy for us to do investing either. In every case, it is hard. But because it's hard, it can actually be very lucrative. Because imagine if it was super easy for anyone to invest in African markets and people were still not investing. That would mean that, for lack of a better word, Africa as a continent was uninvestable. But today, where most African countries still have a lot of barriers, tax systems are not transparent, there aren't incentives to invest that maybe make your tax burden lower, there aren't friendly ecosystems like in the US or in Europe which encourage you to invest in startups, there aren't particular incentives like in Israel or in Italy which tell you that investing in SMEs is a good thing. There isn't a lot of, let's say, wealth that's just waiting to go into startups, and people still invest. That tells you that despite all these barriers, there's actually a lot going on. So yeah, I think I'm not going to go too much into details, but look, our travel bill is probably comparable to a company 10 times our size, just because flying across African markets, most African countries don't have direct flights to each other, which means you could be flying for 20, 30 hours and you're leaving from Africa and coming back to Africa. Our logistics bills in general can really scale highly because unfortunately most African professionals, they still struggle with visa access. Many African nationality passports are still relatively weak compared to, say, an American passport or a British one. It's changing over time. Hopefully, the World Cup does play a role in that. But generally speaking, we see that the strength of the passport is still weak, which in practice means that when you go to a country, you need to submit a visa application. And then imagine doing that visa application not digitally through an e visa, but through a physical embassy. And then imagine going to that embassy, which has one embassy officer working 1 day a week processing 1,000 applications every month. Suddenly, you get to a point where these small inefficiencies start to stack up. So, we've certainly had our own experience of dealing with ministries of interior, ministries of foreign trade, governments, and whatnot. But often, for what I would consider and what I think many folks internationally would think of are rudimentary issues. Like, we want to come into country, you have to deal with the Ministry of Defense. Why? Just because no one else has gone through that journey before. But that doesn't mean that that will be the case forever. And I think for anyone who kind of follows in our footsteps, they'll see that even as we do go and work through particular problems, just like any other startup or investment firm, usually once someone solves a problem, it becomes easier for the rest of the market after that. I just think we found ourselves to be a first mover in some parts.
Is there a minimum requirement to invest in Africa or to join the Dream VC
No,
program?
no, not really. In fact, I would say that generally speaking, and I think some of our alumni have actually written some great articles about this, there's probably 10 to 20 different ways you can get involved, and many of them don't involve any money. The biggest resource that any of us have is time. I would say if I had to really rank up the resources we have, time is the biggest. Time is limited, no matter who you are. Could be Bill Gates, could be a random child born today. You still are limited by time. Nobody lives forever. There's only 24 hours in the day. There's only so much time you're awake, you're productive, you're able to do anything. Number two is social. Who do you know and how well do you know them? There's this theory that was proven in the early 2000s of 6 handshakes away. You and I all both know Barack Obama. Probably we do. In fact, I imagine it's more like 2 or 3 handshakes away, and we don't even think about it because maybe we don't make it a daily goal to connect to the Obamas, right? But in general speaking, social connections are really, really strong. And only the third most important resource is the financial one. Why do I say that? Well, for example, look at the venture capital world. The way that venture capitalists work is most of the money we invest is not actually our own. Venture capitalists are a professional intermediary. The way that VC funds actually get money is they put a little bit of their own money, anywhere from 1 to 5% of the overall pool that they manage. And then they go to bigger institutions like banks, insurance firms, hedge funds, and they say, look, I am uniquely positioned to invest in technology companies and small businesses. I'm more nimble, I'm faster, I'm on the ground, or I can be on the ground, and I can find these opportunities months, if not years, before a big bank or a big firm will ever see this startup. That's why if you give me your money to manage, I will invest it on your behalf and we will split the profits. I'm oversimplifying, but that's really how VCs work. There are actually many VCs across the continent where, if you looked at the American standards of living, you'd say like they're kind of like bottom 25% of the American kind of society by, by their wealth, income, by their wealth. But the funds they manage, they could be managing tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of money on behalf of someone else. So there's many paths to get involved in that sense where you manage someone else's money. That's number one. Now, for some people, they say, look, I don't want to professionally get involved. They just want to get involved as an individual. Okay, that's a different story. Getting involved as an individual, you can still offer your time, you can still offer your services, you can still offer your expertise, even if you don't have capital. Most businesses, as they grow, especially these startups and SMEs, are growing despite all the problems that they're facing. Not all these problems can be solved with cash. A lot of them is, how do I deal with this particular troublesome customer? How do I build this new product? How do I enter this new market? How do I expand from Nigeria into Ghana? All of these are questions that somebody has an answer to. So, being able to provide your expertise as a lawyer, as a doctor, as an accountant, as a banker, as a software engineer is something that can be a very easy way to get involved in the startup and SME space. And actually, now there are probably more than 10,000 working professionals across African markets who are active investors, but they're investing their time and their services more than their money. So maybe they might only invest $1,000, which in the US wouldn't really get you that far, but they will invest $1,000 and commit 100 hours of their legal expertise per year to support a startup. Those 100 hours come with their own cost. That might be 10,000 or more, not even $100,000 worth of time that you're committing into this company, and that can come in exchange for ownership in the business. So I would say for anyone who's looking to get involved, if you want to get involved from a point of view of having a job, look into the venture capital industry, which comes in many different forms. Some are just investing money, some are investing money and time, some are investing money programmatically through programs like the infamous Y Combinator and Techstars, but the African equivalents of those, or look into incubating companies where your day-to-day job is actually providing that welcoming environment in which startups can grow. All of those can be full-time roles you can do with literally zero money in your bank account. Maybe just enough for your flight ticket over, but otherwise you are good. Meanwhile, on the side of the individual involvement, the most typical is being a business angel, where you invest your own disposable income or you invest from your savings. And the good news here is that actually, unlike the US, unlike Canada, unlike India, unlike Europe or the UK, there are actually less barriers to invest individually if you're investing into African markets than if you're investing abroad. You want to invest in a startup in the US, you're being regulated because for consumer protection reasons, the SEC believes that's a silly idea. Why would you want to invest in a company that might fail? Much better to invest in a big titan that probably won't. That's the general mindset of consumer protection that exists in the US and in Canada and the UK. But if you want to invest in Nigeria, there's no consumer protection for you. If you want to lose all your money by putting it into a business that you think will create fried yams and sell it all over the world and become the next big fast food restaurant, that is entirely on you. So what that means is there's usually no minimum to invest. There's usually no barrier to invest. So as long as you're able to transfer your money from point A to point B, you're able to harness good legal advice and make sure that your investment is recognized and recorded, and you have the proof of ownership for your shares, and that's recognized by a good court of law that is able to protect your interest as a shareholder, you're now an investor. Which means that today, if I wanted to invest in the US, I'd need at least a week. If I wanted to invest in Nigeria, well, I'd need about 5 minutes with my phone to unlock it, open up my Nigerian bank account, send money from point A to point B, confirm receipt, and that's it. Right. So actually investing in that sense is very, very, very easy. And the biggest thing I'd say as a takeaway is just consider that the minimums to actually do something meaningful and potentially have a good financial return are at least a scale of 10, if not a scale of 100 less than to do the same in the UK or the US, just because the cost of different products, the cost of labor, the cost of real estate is that much lower than it is in more capitalized markets.
Mark, so you co-lead Edge, which is the corporate arm of Dream VC. Um, I think the biggest questions investors, especially corporate investors, will ask about African startup is, how do I get my money back? What are you telling these corporations when you try to reach out to them?
I think the best part about the CVC or corporate venture capital as compared to traditional venture capital is actually the corporate part. Most people look at CVC and they think, oh, so that's a worse version of a VC. You have that VC investment and that's the contract and all that, but it's tied back to that anchor that is the corporate. In most people's mind, you ask most startups, what do you think about a corporate? What are the most common words that will appear on the vision board? Slow, laggy, bureaucratic, inefficient, stupid. I'm not going to go further, but usually it goes down a trajectory, a negative one. But most people think the big corporates don't know what's going on. They're disconnected from the, let's say, most innovative things that go on, which is somewhat natural. The bigger a company gets, the harder it is for that company to be nimble and on top of whatever is happening that's new in the industry. But in my mind, I agree that anchor is there, but people just focus on the anchor and they don't think what the anchor is anchoring in the sense, just in the proverbial metaphor. What is an anchor? An anchor is something that holds back a much, much bigger boat from moving. And people look below the water and just see the anchor, but they don't see the proverbial battleship sitting above the water, which is the actual corporate. So even though corporates are slower, they come with bureaucratic issues, they come with internal politics within the corporate, between different business units, through to the management, through to the board, through to the shareholders. There are many different processes that aren't efficient. They also have a lot of resources which are essentially underused, underutilized, and which can be completely life-saving to a startup. I'll give you a very practical example. Many people in Nigeria and in West Africa have now heard of this company called PalmPay. PalmPay is now one of the 3 fastest growing apps in any app store across Africa. They have more than 40 million users. It's a fantastic tech business, which essentially operates a little bit like PayPal. It enables you to pay from one individual to another, to pay bills, to invest in products, and more. But most people don't know is that PalmPay entered the market after there were already hundreds, if not thousands, of fintechs trying to offer the same service, even in the same country where they started. They started in Nigeria. And not only that, but PalmPay didn't start in any of the big industrial hubs. They didn't start in the big cities where most of their target users are. They actually started with some of the rural areas. But what enabled PalmPay to succeed and to scale and to become this business that's approaching $1 billion valuation today is that one of their first ever partners and their corporate investors was a corporation. It was one of the biggest mobile phone manufacturers in Africa. That mobile phone manufacturer wanted insight on the financial sector. They wanted to understand fintechs and payments, and they knew that building that internally, that's going to take you dozens of team members who have to be re-educated on financial services, which has nothing to do with mobile phone manufacturing. They have to now compete with banks and with these neobanks and with everybody else. You're going to spend millions of dollars and you might not succeed. Instead, why not look out into the market, figure out who is really smart and who is doing well in the market, and then give them a little bit of your corporate resources. What does that mean? Coming in and pre-installing the PalmPay app on millions of phones that you're shipping to Nigeria and somewhere else. What does that do? Suddenly, this app doesn't need to compete on banners or on ads on a road where there are 1 of 10 fintechs. You buy a phone and it gives you basically the Internet Explorer advantage. In the same way as we always joke that, who uses Internet Explorer? You get a phone, you get your laptop, you go and switch to something else like Google Chrome or Safari or whatever else you're using. But still, Internet Explorer is one of the biggest browsers in the world because it comes pre-installed. PalmPay came pre-installed. Now, That is a very specific case, a payment app that came on a phone and a lot of payments happen through phones. So they essentially managed to get a huge head start on many peers because of that corporate resource. But if you think about it from the corporate mentality, every corporation in every sector will have some inefficiencies, some things where you're not using your full inventory, you're not using all of your employees. I mean, there's a reason why there's a stereotype that you go into a corporate office and half the people are watching YouTube or playing on their phones or doing something else. It's because unless you're maybe Elon Musk or in his immediate surrounding, no one's working 24/7 like a crazy robot and fully focused on the product, which means at any point in time, the corporate is basically wasting some resources. And usually those resources are something that the startup really, really, really needs. Office space, warehouse space, import connections, export connections, regulatory relationships, just the experience of drafting legal contracts. So something that the corporate already spends money on and gets no utility out of can be used as part of an investment process to invest in startups. So that already tells any international corporate, whoever you are, you're a John Deere producing tractors, you're a big healthcare conglomerate in Europe, you're a big insurance player in maybe in Eastern Europe or something else, you want to enter African markets, you have something they really, really, really need, and it's not just money. It could be completely non-monetary, that part of the partnership. Now, the flip side, what a corporation doesn't have is they don't have the ability to operate without scrutiny. Many big businesses, they're listed. Every day someone's writing a report about them. Journalists are following every executive. There's a mass surveillance of every big corporate around the world. If any NVIDIA co-executive had a run-in or a scandal, for example, while on a trip to Honolulu or on holiday in Thailand, guaranteed it's going to affect the whole NVIDIA stock price, despite the fact that this was tens of thousands of employees and their individual indiscretion had no effect on the core business. That's just the way the world works. Everything is interconnected. Everything except private markets. In private markets, especially in less digitized markets across African markets, a lot of the things that happen that startups do is only disclosed or really becomes common knowledge years and years down the line. So in these environments where the biggest opportunities for wealth creation exist, there's also a big degree of opaqueness, a big degree of freedom where small businesses can get into conversations, get into doors, speak to customers without anybody knowing. So instead of competing with 5, 6, 10, 50 other behemoths for trying to capture 1% more of the market in Ohio, you could be actually controlling 20, 30, 40% of all sales of a particular product in Morocco, and nobody would be the wiser back in the States or in Europe or somewhere else. So actually, there's a lot of visibility, access, intelligence, and cheaper research and development, testing, and digitization that you can harness by having your core base make money, earn money, generate revenue in, let's say, capitalized markets, but doing all your research, all your testing, all the development, all the innovative stuff in less capitalized markets. And it benefits you as a corporate because your costs are much lower and your gains are much higher, but it also benefits the local ecosystem. And that's how you can build these ties. In many ways, if you think about the stereotype we all have of, customer support or back office being built out of India or Pakistan, for example, what has that done? Well, maybe to a typical British or American consumer, that just means you call the bank and you expect there's going to be an Indian voice on the other line. But in practice, that's also created probably about 5 million tech professionals across Pakistan and India. And what are these professionals now doing? They're contributing to the economy in Pakistan and India, not in the UK, which means they're paying taxes, they're engaging with the ecosystem and formal labor. And that's the same effect we're going to see. So in many ways, corporates entering the market, it's like a net win for everyone. And I only hope to see that continue to scale. So for anyone looking to explore the market on our side, that's really all we do. We help corporations understand the resources that you have. We help them understand the markets in which you can operate, and we help you solve the, let's say, boring or conventional supply and demand, pricing, and product related problems by connecting, partnering, and investing in startups and SMEs, specifically in emerging markets where we believe they can have the most disruptive effect. And if you want to then buy these companies and take them to San Francisco, I mean, be my guest. Only wins from there.
Mark, where do you see Dream VC in the next 10 years?
Wow. Hard question. I always fear someone's going to ask me that because I answer differently depending on the day, the morning, how well caffeinated I am, and mood I find myself. That comes back to my point on private sector companies kind of doing what they want and not having that much, responsibility. I'm not saying that we operate like that, but I think for us as a relatively early stage business, I would say we've done a lot objectively from the outside point of view as a company in a few years, but we still have so much more that we can do. So number one, we aren't really Pan-African. We try to be, but we are not in all 54 African countries. I really, really hope that eventually that becomes a reality. We already have some reach into very difficult markets like the Democratic Republic of Congo, like the Burkina Faso, like Niger, like Madagascar, and many others. I really hope we can continue to grow their reach into other markets that are traditionally challenging and bring those markets into also having a technology investment ecosystem, an entrepreneurship ecosystem, a corporate investment ecosystem. So I hope that's going to happen. That's number one. Number two, I think we actually are in a interesting position, especially after COVID, where the world briefly went fully digital and then went back to, let's say, the physical real life, to be a bit of that bridge that bridges the digital and the non-digital. So our team is intentionally widespread across Africa, across Europe, across the Middle East, across Asia. And I really, really hope that at some point, the bridges that we've built for ourselves to essentially enable investment flows, to enable our business, are bridges that we can extend to others. In the same way as we currently train individuals to become fantastic investment professionals across African markets, I think it would be fantastic if there were areas for them to learn from, share knowledge with, and exchange lessons with similar investors in Indian markets, in the Middle East, in Latin America, and Southeast Asia. I think historically, most people think of the world as being divided into North and West. I mean, go back far enough, it used to be capitalist and communist, but now it's North and South, I mean, North and South, right? But realistically, North and South divides, they aren't actually a good thing. In many ways, it's the South to South connection where most wealth will be generated in the future. And I think it would be really great if we were in some ways enabling that, enabling knowledge exchange, enabling cross investments. So I'd love to see a future where, for example, most of the funds we work with weren't just funds out of the UK or Nigeria or Germany or France coming into Nigeria, but were India into Africa funds, were Latin America into Africa funds, were Africa into Middle East funds, for example, bridging developing market to developing market and hopefully changing the way the world order works.
In a bio that's full of very serious credentials, you put in there that, and I quote, that you're an enthusiastic fan of hippos. What is it about hippos, Mark?
Oh, well, I love this one. This is what I'm happy to answer. So there's a few things, right? Firstly, very, very random, even for me. And it's just been something that's kind of been in the back of my mind ever since a kid. I think when I was very, very small, at some point, I had gone with my parents as a kid to someone else's house. I was always quite sick as a kid. And I remember seeing a fluffy hippo or something. And I thought, wow, this animal is really cool, looks cute, but also like strong, but then it looks quite different to anything I've ever seen. And obviously, growing up, I'd never seen a hippo in my life. Hippos don't tend to do well in minus 30 Celsius weather in Moscow or anywhere else. Maybe there was one or two in the zoo, but it's not quite the same thing seeing a hippo in the zoo as seeing them in the wild. But over time, I think, especially as I started working in African markets over this last, I would say, 9, 10 years or so, there's been something that was quite interesting anecdotally as I started to get exposed to African continent. And that is that a hippo as an animal, it's something that is very much a dual perspective. There's the way people see hippos in movies and cartoons and in books. It's a big, fluffy, friendly, and it's kind of a herbivore, so obviously it can't do any bad. And then there's the way you see hippos in real life. If anyone actually gets to see a hippo, and as I've experienced hippo in Tanzania and Uganda and Nigeria and not Nigeria and South Africa and many other places, it's a wild beast that weighs about 2 tons that can run at about 40 kilometers an hour, so a little bit faster than Usain Bolt, and that if it hit you would feel basically like a house collapsing on your head. So this is quite literally a pretty terrifying sight if you actually imagine a hippo chasing you, and at the same time the hippo is this thing. So for me, I think just to some extent, it was something that I was always fascinated by as an animal. I thought it was a pretty unique and interesting animal that on one side is cute and friendly, on the other side is not. On one side is a herbivore, on the other side is a beast. On one side has this mythical lore in many countries where people associate hippos with some deities or gods or something else. On the other side, it's something that you imagine would you find in a zoo. It's very like normalized, and nobody thinks of a hippo as scary, unlike a lion or a cheetah. So it has that dual nature. I think to some extent, so do I. I mean, there's many things in which I'm very, very serious, and in some things I'm very protective of my time, of my close friends, of my family and those around me. A bit like a hippo is very territorial. In other ways, you once people get to know me, they realize I'm not that scary and not necessarily that serious. And a bit like a hippo, can enjoy my time just chilling or relaxing for like a day at a time and not do anything, and I'm perfectly fine with that. So I think in some ways I found my spirit animal through a hippo, and I've just carried that with me into professional life as well.
No, I appreciate that, and also seeing in your bio, I think that's fascinating. Most people would not put stuff like that in your bio. That goes to show your character and your personality. So I appreciated that at least. Mark, at a young age, you've accomplished a lot, man. What motivates you?
I'd say probably to a degree curiosity. I mean, most people don't know this, but I'm actually a middle son. I'm the second son in the family, and I think a lot of people there's a stereotype of you grow up with like something on your shoulder. You need to kind of out achieve, out accomplish as a middle kid, which probably played a role for sure on a subconscious level. But on a conscious level, I think curiosity is definitely the biggest driver of a lot of what I do. If I think back to, for example, why I first got fascinated with mathematics at some point, I used to be very much focused on maths, and that's what drove my interest in economics. I think mathematics is all about problem solving. You're trying to make sense of the world essentially through numbers, and economics is trying to make sense of systems through money. So, in many ways, it's a bit similar to that. I mean, my latest study of geography is very much a curiosity about what do I not understand about the world. How can I change my worldview? How can I be less, let's say, North centric or less British centric or less Russian centric or Ukrainian centric in the way that I think about the world? And I think often it's by traveling, by meeting new people, by interacting with different people, different cultures, different working behavior. That's the only way that you become a bit more holistic as an individual. And I think the same applies to my day to day now. I have now probably seen, I don't know, probably upwards of 5,000 startups across my professional career. And yet still, there is something where every time I open a pitch deck, a presentation from a startup, or go on a website, I get like excited, almost like a little kid again, because I feel like there's this underlying curiosity that I'm always looking for someone to prove me wrong, teach me something new, find something new. So it's the same thing that drives me to read, that drives me to travel, that drives me to work countryside in Nigeria and Ghana and DRC, anywhere else. It's a certain degree of a curiosity for what do I not know yet. So for so far so good. So far, every single year I've been somewhere new. I've learned something new. I've learned from someone new. I've met someone new, and I hope that energy keeps me going for a while. But I think that's certainly a big part of how I live my life.
Excellent, man. This was great. Mark, I'm going to move into my rapid fire question very soon. But before I do that, I wanted to ask you, is there anything important, any important topic that we did not cover today that you think we need to cover before we wrap up?
Well, I think there's something that I'll say, and this is maybe more just a serious point, not so much a social one, and that is that um, we have this perception whenever we talk, whether on podcasts and conferences and summits and conversations around helping African markets. I think helping African markets has been ongoing for about 50 to 70 years. I'd really love it if the general narrative moved to a more capital centric conversation. And that's why I really love that we are on a capital centric conversation here. I think most of the time now, if you speak to venture capitalists or private equity investors or these private investors in African markets, their first and primary motivation is I want to make money and ideally do good while I'm doing it. They are not thinking I want to do good and maybe hypothetically make money. And that's a very, very, very clear distinction that has mostly shifted in this last 10 years. But for many international investors, diaspora professionals, and others sitting abroad, they still look at Africa as a combined continent and they look at the narrative and they think of, Red Cross or UNICEF, and that's what shapes the narrative. Help first, make money later. So I think as soon as we can make that general mentality change, that can really open up doors. On the corporate side, the mentality change that we can actually make a lot of money and affect a lot of lives by expanding into African markets. While if more corporations thought like that, the markets would be so much bigger than that. On the investment level, if we believed you can make a lot of money and affect a lot of change, we would see much more liquid stock exchanges, which would make it much easier to do business for anyone, local or international, across Africa today. And that's not yet happening. And on the individual level, if at least 1 in 5 among the diaspora professionals, for example, who are currently sending money back home, as you said, and maybe not always doing more beyond that, if at least 1 in 5 wanted to become an entrepreneur, join a startup, support a startup, advise a startup, mentor a startup, or even just take some of the money they send back home for schooling or for typical expenses and instead put that into investing into SMEs and startups, you'd probably easily double or triple the entire African investment ecosystem in 1 year. So there's a lot that can be done just through a mindset shift. And I really, really encourage anyone listening, anyone later unpacking this to just consider that even if you don't know what the next path is for you, if you're a corporate, there's a route for you to engage in the space. You're an individual, there's a route. you're a working professional, there's a route. So there's a path for everyone.
Excellent, 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 Mark. I really appreciate that, especially coming from someone who's not originally from Africa. Just hearing you say that, I think that's very profound. We talk a lot about investing in opportunities. Let me talk about a different kind of investment for a second. Your health is your highest return on investment. That's why I created a brand called Bow Action. We make Vestly Pro adjustable weighted vest, currently on Amazon. The vest adds up to 35 pounds to your body weight, including wrist and ankle weights. If you're serious about investing in your health and not just your portfolio, and you want to support this channel and what we're building, please check out the link in the description below. Every purchase goes directly into keeping these conversations going. Thank you very much for your support. All right, Mark, let's get into the rapid fire questions. What is your biggest win so far?
Probably getting married. That's the safe answer. I'm gonna say that's the safe answer because I know my wife will be listening at some point. But yeah, no. Honestly, I think considering my work-life balance, any of my friends who know me, there were times in my life where I was doing at least 100, 110-hour work weeks, and I think that's something that people normalize a lot in the startup space. It's literally working yourself to the bone, working crazy hours in person, remote, and all the things in between. The fact that within that, I found a little bit of time for loved ones around me. I think that's certainly my biggest win. That's it.
What about your biggest mistake?
I think biggest mistake was believing that I am not allowed to do something, or I'm not allowed to be whoever I want to be just because I don't have an immediate comparable around me. I think a lot of people believe a lot in doing something based on something you experience or someone you can see. And I think this is where a lot of the issues in society come from. For example, a lot of women in general believe they cannot become a startup founder because they don't know anyone around them who is a startup executive. You look on the news and it's all white guys largely raising millions or billions of dollars. But often there needs to be someone who goes first. And I think in the same way, for me, I didn't know anyone in my professional circles until I did, who was working in African markets, but it's something that I always was quite curious about. And I kind of wish I actually started to look into that earlier. There's a lot of things that have happened in the last 10 years, and potentially, both financially, socially, I could have been much more exposed to those if I had just taken that step a bit earlier. So I think just recognizing that sometimes, even if you don't know anyone, you don't know anything, you don't know how to get started, you just need to take that leap, even if it's a small leap, because sometimes the opportunities are vast as long as you take that initial first step.
Was there one book that changed your thinking?
I used to read a lot. I don't read as much now, mostly just because of time. I still read it quite a bit. And there's probably a book recently that changed my thinking quite a bit, which is one by Ilyas Tribulayev. It's really all about corporate venturing. And I'm just trying to remember the book name. I think if I remember correctly, it's called The Venture Mindset. Yeah. Venture Mindset, and something where this professor at Stanford and one of his colleagues essentially unpack how venture capitalists think about the world in a little bit of a crazy way. It's like you threw your head into a washing machine and it's all scrambled over. And this is why you kind of ignore social convention and ignore what can work and come to an industry which hasn't been innovated for 100 years, like the taxi industry, and say, you know, sorry for my French, but screw you, we're going to change everything and adapt everything. To do that, you need to be a bit of a, not dystopian, a bit of a unusual, out of the box type of thinker. And I think that out of the box thinking tends to work well in entrepreneurship and venture. And this book really introduced that to me. So I think this is the book that more recently perhaps made me feel a bit more comfortable. I think for some years already, I've always been a bit confident in my decisions, but this one really helped me feel, you know what, I'm not crazy. For a while, whatever I've been doing, everyone I know has been saying, okay, this works, but eventually this is not going to work. Whether with venture investing, with the startup entrepreneurship, like you've been terribly lucky, but something's going to break. And looking at this book, I realized that actually, no, not necessarily. There are many, many, many people just like me in every environment, from government to corporate to small business. And sometimes being the outlier is not a bad thing. So I think that's probably the recent one. But, just to throw like a crazy answer in there for the record, I imagine you asked this to a few people. There's a book I read, a fictional one, called Master and Margarita. A little bit like master, like a masterdom, and margarita like the pizza, which is a book written by a Russian author in the 20th century, which is actually amazing because this is like a spiritually, psychologically, philosophically challenging book. And it basically really turns the traditional idea of how there's good in everyone on its head. And it suggests like there's potential for good in everyone and there's potential for bad in everyone. And to some extent, the whole principle of the book is dealing with the mythical and the non-mythical, but understanding yourself a little bit better and understanding your control or lack thereof over your own feelings and emotions and everything else. I remember when I read this book, I proverbially felt like my brain exploded. This book was definitely one of those that completely changed my mind. And, it's translated into many languages. So for anybody else who is looking for something that perhaps completely changes your mind, I would say Master and Margarita. For anybody else who wants to validate that being crazy in the VC or startup space is normal, then The Venture Mindset by Elias Turbalat.
Mark, if you had $10,000 to invest in Africa today, what would it be?
I'm going to be selfish here. I'm going to say I would invest it in ourselves. Our business is going really well, so we've been going great, and I'm pretty much putting all of the money that we make back into our growth because it's been tremendously well returning from a ROI point of view. But if I couldn't do that, what I'd probably do is I'd invest in one or two startups, split that money again to the point it could be even like very, very small tickets, and put that money into some businesses that are trying to do something that today is on the verge of being illegal or forbidden. But if it ever became legal, would be a tremendously, tremendously successful investment. So this is something that I think is only possible in African markets. There are a lot of countries which have never written regulation on a particular industry. There just never was a regulation on whether crypto, for example, is enabled or not, whether P2P payments are legal or not. And I've invested in a couple of businesses like this before. I think sometimes just imagining what might be possible if the overall market improves is amazing. So yeah, for example, I recently invested in an Algerian business for the first time, and I'm really betting on a lot of things happening, which, the prediction odds of that is like 1 in 100. But if it works out, this would be 100 to 1. The returns would be absolutely phenomenal. So I intend to continue doing that. So next time I find something crazy that might just be amazing if all the stars align, that's probably where my checks are going.
One thing that needs to change for Africa to reach its potential.
One thing that needs to change, just one, not 100 or 1,000. One. There's so many. I feel like I'm a greedy kid. I have a lot of things on the shopping list of the Christmas list of what I wish would happen that doesn't happen yet. But honestly, if it was just one, I'd probably say ease of travel. Ease of travel. Is there something that is a given? Like, you wake up in New York. If you want to be by 3, 4, 5 hours later, you can be in San Francisco. You want to get to Miami, you're there. You want to get to Cancun, you're there. You want to go to Toronto, you're there. It's easier to move around in the States. Even easier in Europe. There are flights that go for $10 that I can go inter-country and literally fly as if I'm taking a bus. Like, travel has been completely democratized across the US, across parts of Europe, and across most of Asia. India is a great example of this as well. Ridiculous number of flights day to day across all the big cities. You look at African markets, I think every airport I've been to is operating underneath capacity. They have the capacity to run 5, 10 times more flights. I've been to countries where there's 5 flights per day globally out of this airport, and they have the capacity for like 250. So a lot of this comes down to the costs of fuel, the negotiations around travel borders, the issues with visas, the issues with there not being a precedent from you ever having flown from country A to country B. None of these are unsolvable. All of these are literally solvable with a conversation, probably between two heads. So you just need to find the right head number one, the right head number two, and force them to have a conversation with each other. If that would happen, then you'd see a lot more people flying between borders across Africa. You'd see a lot of inter-African trade. You'd see a lot more inter-African collaboration. And I think a lot of the negativity that we see in the news, a lot of the issues that we see plaguing African countries year in, year out, comes back from either misinformation, disinformation, or an inability to solve problems across borders. So if travel became easier and more affordable, I think a lot of these problems would be resolved. Most people, I believe, generally want the best for the world. So as long as we stop putting guardrails and telling them visa denied every single time, then I think we can make the world a much better place.
With that being said, do you think Africa can ever unite as one country?
No. Quick answer, no. I don't think so. I think it can't, and I think it shouldn't. I don't think it's a question that I can answer in a simple, quick manner, but I think just based on the amazing demographic diversity and the heterogeneity of the African continent, I think there are more cultural groups, more languages, and more diversity in the African continent than in any other continent around the world. In that sense, I don't think at any point it would be in their collective best interest if all of these were grouped together. I mean, if you look at the current national borders of many African countries, unfortunately, these national borders trace back to a time when someone outside the country decided that this is how these countries or these ethnic groups or these collectives or tribes or communities should come together. And that often hasn't worked and has actually led to some negative consequences down the line. So I don't think unity is always for the best. In the same way as how, you ask some Texans and you ask them, where do you live? They don't say the US, they say we live in Texas. People have an identity to a place, a time, a people, a land, a group. And I think those identities remain over time. What I would see, though, is that I definitely can see a much more connected and much more united African continent in the economic sense or in the technological sense. If European countries who've been fighting since the start of history with each other, most of whom argue over football, over flags, over color, over men, over women, over everything, if they can argue over everything and somehow 25 or more of these countries can come together to create the biggest economic and travel and labor union in history, the European Union, I don't see any reason why the African Union and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement cannot reach that scale or even surpass that in years to come. So can Africa feel like a country? Yes. Can Africa be a country? No, I don't think so.
My last and final question. At the end of every episode, I ask my guests what they want to leave on the bridge. The bridge is where I expect something to be left that's specific, either a specific resource, a specific contact, specific opportunity for the audience. Mark, what would you want to leave on the bridge?
Wow, that's great. I mean, a lot. We'd love to leave an extension to the bridge. And I think the biggest extension is just a path, right? I mentioned how there are paths to enter the space. Well, for anyone who wants to enter the African markets or extend their reach into African markets or professionalize what they do in African markets, specifically from an investment point of view, I guess number one, please check out Dream VC. Dream VC runs training programs all year round, remote and non-remote, in Africa and Europe and the US and everywhere with that African focus. So check out our programs and consider signing up for one of those. I think that would be great. Number two, check out Edge, our corporate unit, for any corporations listening in, whether based in Africa, based outside. Look, you've probably heard a lot of negativity about African markets, and yet you've seen other people make unimaginable returns. 100 times their money, 500 times their money, 50,000 times their money by investing in the right way in African markets. So let's chat and let's see how we can do the same with you. And then finally, is just consider that, it's still such a space where it's really a who you know economy, a who you know world we live in, where who you know matters much more than what you know. So insofar as, we have the institute to teach you the what you know, if you want to know the right people and in any way we can help you do that and we can connect you to that space, I'm a very easy person to reach. I still live in the generation where people put their entire handle as their literal name. So if anybody wants to reach me, just at Mark Kleyner on pretty much any social media platform. I'm still old enough, to use Facebook. That's still alive, but otherwise LinkedIn or Instagram or anything else is fine.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, this has been excellent. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for opening up about, what's going on with Dream VC. Thank you for being on the continent. Thank you for helping our people grow. Thank you for everything you do for the continent. Again, I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Kwame.
Absolutely.